presented very quickly then. That's impressive. So, good evening, and thank you to everyone for coming to this evening's event. I hope it's not the last day of summer, but I'm assuming people will drift in a little bit because it's tricky and people have got lost finding their way to New Cross and finding their way around Goldsmiths, so hopefully they'll wander in a bit later. But I want to thank you all for coming tonight to mark the 25th anniversary of Identities Journal, Identities Global Studies in Culture and Power. I'm Claire Alexander, and I'm the current editor of Identities. And I want to start with a couple of very brief thank yous. Firstly to Taylor and Francis, who are the publishers of the journal, the University of Manchester School of Social Sciences and the Department of Sociology at Goldsmiths, who have worked together to make tonight's event possible and for their support for the journal over the last few years. I also want to thank my associate editors, Brett and Louis and Raminda Kaur, who are here, and Nasamir, who unfortunately couldn't make it. I think he might be on a beach in Cornwall. A member of our editorial board, I think some people are here, certainly some people who've reviewed for the journal I know are here, so it's nice to see them. And importantly, our journal manager, Hazel, who I can't see, she's hiding somewhere. For all their work in bringing this together. And I also want to thank our sister journal, Ethnic and Racial Studies, particularly John Solomos, who's now gone to Stockholm, Martin Bulmer, who is here, and Amanda Easter-Bleakley for their support over the past few years. So it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome and to introduce tonight's speaker, Gary Young. Gary is an award-winning author, broadcaster and journalist. He's worked at The Guardian since 1993 and was appointed as their US correspondent in 2003. He came back to the UK in 2015 and is currently The Guardian's editor-at-large. He also writes a monthly column for The Nation, and he's won a number of awards for his journalism, including last year the James Aronson Career Achievement Award from City University of New York. He's made a number of radio and TV documentaries on a wide range of subjects, and he's also the author of, slightly envious when I say this, 5 books, including the insightful 2010 book, Who Are We and Should It Matter in the 21st Century, which poses difficult questions around the problem of identity, which hopefully we'll be thinking a bit more about tonight. And the most recent is his wonderful and heartbreakingly prescient award-winning 2016 book, Another Day in the Death of America, which I think speaks urgently and poignantly to issues addressing London and the wider UK today, and which he and his colleagues have been building on in their Guardian series Beyond the Blade. A Day in the Death of America and Who Are We, like all of Gary's work, are defined not only by his insights but by his compassion and his warmth and his humanity, by a focus on the everyday, the mundane, the personal, but also with a very sharp, critical eye to the broader histories, social, political, cultural and economic structures in which these are entangled, and the dilemmas and the dead ends and opportunities that arise in those encounters. Nina Glick-Schiller founded Identities Journal 25 years ago to explore the ways in which questions of culture and identity, race, ethnicity and nation have become central to social and political life, and how culture and identity are at the heart of the struggle for recognition, equality and justice. 25 years on, and as the events of the last few weeks alone in Britain have shown, dramatically I think, from the Windrush children to the anniversary of Powell's speech to Stephen Lawrence, series of really miserable, actually, anniversaries, to the spate of knife and gun deaths scarring London and beyond, these issues are as central and as live today as ever. So I think Gary is the perfect person to mark our 25th anniversary, and we're delighted and honoured to welcome him tonight. One final thing, Gary came up to Manchester in November to give our annual Arthur Lewis lecture, which was wonderful. And we were so completely transfixed by it that at one point all the lights in the lecture theatre went out halfway through the talk because we were really still. So I'm going to just, I think they thought the hall was empty. So if I can ask you occasionally, perhaps just to shift in your seats or like occasionally wave their arms around or something, that would be really helpful. So I'm going to pass now over to my colleague and associate editor Brett from Lou, who's going to chair tonight's session, also to welcome Gary. So thank you.
Thank you, Claire. On behalf of the Sociology Department, I'd like to welcome you all here to Goldsmiths. We're very excited to host this event, the 25th anniversary of Identities Journal. I'd also like to echo Claire's thanks. Thanks to Taylor and Francis. Also thanks to the University of Manchester School of Social Sciences, and also to Ethnic and Racial Studies for their continued support. I'd like to thank Hazel as well, who I don't see, our journal manager. But I'd also like to thank Goldsmiths Sociology Departmental Coordinator, Jane May Martin. I'm looking at you right now, Jane May. Thanks very much for all of the work that you've put into this event. Thank you very, very much. As Claire has already said, we're extremely fortunate to have Gary here tonight to give this anniversary lecture. So I don't want to take up much more of our valuable time. Gary, I believe, is going to speak for around 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for questions. And then afterwards, you're welcome to join us for a wine reception outside. Claire, I'm not sure if the lights in here are motion activated. They may be, they may not be. So that's fine. But if, by all means, move about a bit if you want. But what I would like to remind everybody, or tell everybody, inform everybody, is that this session is being recorded by video, and that will be available sometime in the future via the Identities website. One last thing before we start, if I can just ask everybody to either put your mobiles either on silent or to turn them off. Thank you. Tonight, you're welcome tonight's speaker, Gary Young.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Goldsmiths. The last time I was here, I was on the picket line with the lecturers, I'm proud to say, and took a quick detour from the front of the building to back here, where we were told some people were sneaking in, thinking that they would be unseen. So it was kind of a bit of shaming at the back there. In 2006, while writing an article about the manner in which the term political correctness was used to undermine progress, inequality and climates of civility, I asked the Guardian Library to do a search on its uses. And I found that in the space of 1 month that year, political correctness was used in the British press on average 10 times a day. Twice as frequently as Islamophobia, 3 times as often as homophobia, and 4 times as often as sexism. During that period, political correctness was used to refer to the ill treatment of rabbits, the teaching of Gaelic, Mozart's opera La Clemenza di Tito, the flower show in Paris, and the naming of the Mazda 3 MPS. By that time, political correctness had effectively come to mean anything that you wanted it to mean, so long as you didn't like it. I feel that the term identity politics has much the same currency at present. These are the headlines from the first page of a Google search for identity politics in the news. Could the Windrush scandal end identity politics in Britain? Spectator. Are identity politics emancipatory or regressive? Andrew Cuomo's identity politics leave out one group, the middle class, the Washington Times. Anti-Semitism and the threat of identity politics, the Financial Times. House Speaker Paul Ryan warns against identity politics, Wall Street Journal. Paul Ryan loves identity politics, the Rolling Stone. Listen to this recent piece from Commentary magazine. As if the peddlers of identity politics hadn't done enough to poison Western culture in the here and now, they have now set their sights on the afterlife. That is the metaphysical meaning of the expression rest in power, which has replaced the old rest in peace among the woke crowd. The attempt to carry the struggle beyond the grave is a reminder that liberal identity politics is a quasi-religious or quasi-spiritual movement. So clearly, we lack a working definition for what identity politics means. But if we were to sum up how it's being used, it's a term that relates to any kind of political intervention which intentionally targets a group in which people share common essential attributes like race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, ethnicity. with the perceived aim of gaining sectional advantage. And this is generally characterised as an insult, even though, if you take away the sectional advantage bit, it would apply to the suffragettes, the African National Congress, disability rights campaigners, or Martin Luther King. And since, thanks to malign intervention, the term identity politics has been rendered meaningless, I think the logical thing for right-minded people to do is retire its use. Which is why the title of this talk is The Politics of Identity, from potential to pitfalls and symbols to substance. Because even though identity politics isn't a term I feel is worth claiming or even necessarily critiquing much anymore, I do believe that there is always identity in politics. None of us come to politics from a vacuum. We arrive with affiliations that mould our worldview. It was no coincidence that women led the charge for female suffrage, or that Ghanaians spearheaded the battle for Ghanaian independence. Had they waited for men or British occupiers to come around to those ideas, they might still be waiting. Everybody really understands this, apart from the people powerful enough to be ignorant, because in general, the more power an identity carries, the less likely its carrier is to be aware of it as an identity at all. Nobody's ever asked me, when did you come out as straight? People don't ask me, how do you balance childcare and work? Or how can you prove that you will return home after this holiday? If you're less likely to think that, if they are less likely to think that masculinity or Western citizenship and the privileges that come with them are anything but the normal state of affairs. If your identity is never interrogated, then it's easy to be seduced by the idea that you don't have one. Strip people of their citizenship, recategorize their ethnicity, or put them in a place where they become a minority and see how quickly they cling to the attributes they have inherited. These contradictions are usually obvious to all but those who have them. Absent of any awareness that they too possess a perspective rooted in their own experience, every food with which they are unfamiliar is ethnic food, and every month is their history month. Some call this objectivity, and one must assume that had they been born a girl in India or a boy in the 18th century, their worldview would be exactly the same. But follow that logic and you are left with a person who lives out with history, geography or civilization, and those people simply don't exist. And then there are those on the left who will only be guided by material concerns. For them, and of course I reserve the harshest criticism for my own side, because they should know better, analysis of Western society is rooted in the 19th century and hasn't grown much since. Class, they claim, is the holy grail, and all else is not only secondary, but subsidiary. When tens of thousands of Americans, most of them black, take to the streets, for example, to celebrate Obama's election, there are some who effectively tell them to go back home and wait for the disappointment. When women are galvanized and conscientized in their hundreds of thousands over sexual harassment, they are dismissed as indulging in hashtag activism or told it's a union issue. And each time, it's not as though they don't have a point, it's just that they've determinedly missed the point. When women are paid about 20% less than men, then gender is a material concern. When for every $100 that a white person in America has in wealth, an African American has just 5, then race is a material issue. If there's no lift and you're disabled, if you can't marry the person you love, if your children can't eat the food their religious dietary requirements stipulate at school, and you don't feel safe speaking your mother tongue in the street, then these become material issues. In certain circumstances, whether you're British or black or gay, or Iraqi, Hindu or female, can be the difference between life and death, poverty and wealth, citizenship and statelessness. Now, since we are both many things, female, white, English, gay, whatever, and just one, ourselves, identity is in its very nature intersectional. And its intersection with class is vital to understanding how identity and class work. To try and understand identity without understanding class would be to misunderstand them both altogether. But the relationship between the two is fluid, not fixed, and symbiotic, not subordinate. Labour in the white skin, like that great flaky identity nut Karl Marx, can never free itself as long as Labour in the black skin is brown. So there is always identity in politics. But that doesn't necessarily mean there is always politics in identity. Not all identities are political or even social. Some are strictly personal. And that doesn't necessarily make them less important to the people involved, but the distinction matters. The notion that the personal is political gained currency during the 60s thanks to the feminist movement, and we're all better for it. When cast as personal, issues like abortion, domestic violence, housework, childcare responsibilities were effectively excluded from broader political conversation, leaving women isolated in their attempts to seek equality, safety and greater freedom. By reframing them as political, feminists opened up fresh terrain for all of us. But along the way, there have been some, not feminists, just some in the identity movement, who equated the personal as political with the emotional is empirical. Personal decisions and psychological decisions were endowed with political import and vice versa. Black people who chose white partners were branded coconuts, and anti-Zionist Jews were diagnosed as self-hating, or as one person put it, they are people of Jewish extraction because they've had all of the Jewishness extracted out of them. Experience gained primacy over argument. A survivor of rape or concentration camps or homophobic or racist attack claimed the right not only to be heard but never to be argued with. People could silence any opposition simply by insisting, I've been through it, I know. And the idea that others who had been through it might have different interpretations, or that those who didn't might have valid things to contribute, were brushed aside. And during a period in which neoliberal thinking and framing became entrenched, identities that are political became effectively tradable, corporatized, commodified, marketed and managed. And this in turn made people cynical and confused. Equal opportunities were replaced with photo opportunities. Eviscerated of their political content, identity became, for some, not about what you did, but how you felt and looked. So identity, I think, has lain abandoned, publicly derided and hypocritically exploited by the right, willfully neglected or carelessly promoted often by the left, shamelessly embraced and marketized by the corporate world. Prone to cynicism, but also the linchpin to great acts of solidarity, both source and pollutant, the starting point for some of the most inspirational moments in politics, the end point for some of the most insidious. And we, and by we I'm projecting onto my immediate audience the assumption of progressive thinkers and doers. Is there any of you who don't fit that category? Welcome. We are partly responsible for this state of affairs. Too little rigour and too much self-indulgence, a tendency to mistake indignation, discomfort or disappointment as a political position has made space for those who would do us harm, sometimes serious harm. Identity is like fire. It can create warmth and comfort or burn badly and destroy. It can make connections over oceans, languages, generations and cultures, but it can also sow division among those who live side by side. On the one hand, we are all more alike than we are unalike. On the other, the ways in which we are unalike matter. For all that's common in the human experience, the differences are stark and in some respects getting starker. And they are also increasingly creating the framework for political activity, public anxiety and at times moral panic. Tonight, I just want to focus on a couple of ways in which this plays out. And I want to start with the distinction and interplay between symbols and substance, since I think this is where we most often, or at least often, get tripped up. And by symbols here, I mean the things that people can and do interpret from landmark signifiers. The first female president, the first gay marriage, a Muslim mayor, a trans CEO, both barrier breakers and figureheads who are held up and lionized or at times lampooned for their representational potential. Now there are some who would like to dismiss this reflex to celebrate these moments out of hand, and I really genuinely understand that. What exactly are we celebrating? The fact that there has never been a female president or an openly gay prime minister or whatever should arguably be a cause for outrage, not joy, when one finally makes it through. And seriously, why should we care? Theresa May is the country's second female prime minister. What use is that to the two mothers who threw their children from Grenfell Towers in the hope that they might be saved? What substantial difference do these things make to people's lives? And I want to engage that point with specific reference to Barack Obama, whose election and most of whose tenure I covered while in America. My son was born the weekend that Obama announced his presidency, his candidacy. And as I pushed him around in his stroller, surrounded by socialist realist type pictures declaring hope and change, I was told by many that Obama's candidacy would signify great things for my son. Osceola, my son, would grow up with an assumption that the highest office in the land was open to him, and that the future would be his. That there was, I was told, nothing that my son could not achieve. And that made very little sense to me. The fact that my son suddenly had a tiny theoretical chance of getting to the White House was less important than the more real chance that he could end up behind bars. 1 in 3 black American boys born in 2001 were destined for the prison system, or dead. 3 black kids are shot in America every day. I wanted a president who would change the odds for the many rather than raise the stakes for a few, and I didn't really care what that president looked like if they were going to get that done. But increasingly, I did come to feel that we should not leave symbols to the simple-minded. We just have to be clear about what we're claiming for the symbols that are available. First, we cannot claim that the advance of an individual is synonymous with the advance of a group. Indeed, in Obama's case, it was the opposite. He was elected in the midst of a financial crisis that hit African Americans hardest. His election was not an indication of narrowing racial inequalities. It actually coincided with a widening of them that would continue throughout his presidency. There's very limited value to the celebration of a glass ceiling being broken when too many people of those same attributes are trapped in the basement. Second, we must understand the connection that people have in the context. People weren't simply celebrating because Obama was black. If Condoleezza Rice or some other black Republican had been elected, the moment would have been understood very differently, and the response among liberals more muted. Obama's politics mattered. So when people said, but don't you think it's wonderful that there's a black president? I'd say, well, no. Let's just kind of unpack that just a little bit. Not least on the central issue of the previous 4 years, the Iraq War, he had opposed it when there was no obvious critical, ambitious reason for doing so. And this is particularly important because the right will generally be far more adept at promoting individuals for underrepresented groups than the left. I've always felt this, that the first, I don't think it's a mistake that the first female prime ministers came from the Conservative Party, or that it's possible that the Republican Party will have a female candidate before, a viable female candidate, a successful one before the Democrats. Because when black people or women or gay people advance on the left, they do so generally alongside the demands of that group. Obama, for example, wouldn't have been possible without the specific changes to the primary process that Jesse Jackson extracted in 1988. So they move slower because they generally take certain demands and communities with them. Whereas on the right, they move as individuals, free from the ties of movement and demands, and therefore can rise much easier as individuals. The issue of connection and context was most evident in the 2016 presidential elections, when white women voted for the sexual harasser rather than the white female liberal. They preferred his agenda of racial exclusion, xenophobia and enemy to that of Hillary Clinton, who effectively promised Obama's third term with stagnant wages, rising health costs and calcifying social mobility. Of course, gender had something to do with her defeat, but to understand it solely through the prism of gender is inadequate given what else we know to be true. Third, we must be cognizant of where these breakthroughs are taking place. Obama's politics mattered, but they were evidently insufficient given the conservative institutions in which he was embedded, the Democratic Party, the Senate, American electoral politics, which made all celebration contingent. There was a limit to what he would ever do. He had to raise immense amounts of money from vested interests and those of the interests he would ultimately serve. He was standing for the President of the United States. That meant he would preside over massive inequality, illegal wars, and shore up its capitalist foundings against all threats, real or imagined. That came with the job description. But there were at least elections. To claim, for example, that the upcoming nuptials of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry are a step forward for black people in Britain, and some have, and more will, fails to engage with what that actually symbolises. Having a royal family establishes inherited privilege at the heart of your system of government and embeds patronage at the centre of your politics. I understand that this is primarily symbolic, but the trouble is, it's symbolic of something quite terrible. The notion that our head of state gains a position not by merit or election, but by birth. Meghan Markle, being the prince's fiancée, illustrates that black people in Britain now have the capacity to be as elitist, exclusionary and hierarchical as whites, and that white elites are prepared to accept them on those terms. Some may call that progress. I don't. So given all the caveats regarding Obama, then what on earth was there to celebrate? Well, his candidacy, coming after 8 years of Bush, became the focal point for hopeful human engagement. Young and black, white, and Latino, drawing on feminist victories in labour history. One could argue that they were deluded and take a kind of shallow comfort in the insistence of false consciousness, that nobody else has a viable understanding of the world apart from you. Or you understand its more layered significance, that this was a moment in which a different story about what might be possible in America could be told. And that recognised what a distance had been travelled in a relatively short time. As the late author Eduardo Galeano told me when I interviewed him, I was very happy when he was elected because this is a country with a fresh tradition of racism. He told me the story of how the Pentagon in 1942 ordered that no black people's blood could be used for transfusion for whites. In history, said Galeano, that is nothing. 70 years is like a minute. So, in such a country, Obama's victory was worth celebrating. The potential of the politics of identity is often to make space for another narrative, a better narrative. A story about how we got here that is more inclusive, egalitarian, hopeful, and humane. And I think that's what's happened over these last couple of weeks with the discussions about the Windrush generation. In the week of the 50th anniversary of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, the country miraculously started celebrating the contributions of black foreigners. We heard about the taxes they paid, the communities they built, the families they grew, and the way they changed Britain for the better. We started to talk about immigrants as though they have humanity, and about immigration as though it could benefit us. I don't want to make too much of this beyond its potential to shift the framing, not least because of the amount of misery it took to get there, and yet the framing matters. Obama's candidacy became this teachable moment about the potential of anti-racist discourse. A year before, Hillary Clinton's strategy, before he was elected, Hillary Clinton's strategist Mark Penn laid out a plan of attack against Obama. All of those articles he wrote about his boyhood in Indonesia and his life in Hawaii are geared towards showing his background as diverse, multicultural, and putting that in a new light. Save it for 2050. It exposes a strong weakness for him. His roots to basic American values and culture are at best limited. I cannot imagine America electing a president during a time of war who is not at his centre fundamentally American in his thinking and in his values. Let's explicitly own American in our programme, the speeches and the values. This is Hillary's goal. He doesn't. Let's use our logo to make some flags we can give out. Let's add flag symbols to the background. When Obama won, this worldview was defeated. Not definitively, we have Trump now, but momentarily. And while we've gone backwards, we are not, I believe, back to where we were. Now, the limits to this, as any kind of project, should be clear. It was under Obama's presidency that the most significant anti-racist movement in the last 40 years erupted in the form of Black Lives Matter. Yet from the outside, the debate took place almost completely without reference to the fact that the nation's first black president was in situ. On one level, it seemed as though his relationship to some of the key issues surrounding black life in America was almost ornamental. He was the framed poster in the barbershop or the nail salon, the mural on the underpass, the picture in the diner or the bodega, an aspiration not to be mistaken for the attrition of daily life. The question as to whether America can elect a black president had been answered, but the issue of the sanctity of black life had yet to be settled. Symbols should not be mistaken for substance, but they should not be dismissed as insubstantial either. And it's in this basic tension, why does it matter, whom does it impact, what difference will it make to people's lives, in whose name and to what purpose are these identities conjured and evoked, that the pitfalls in the politics of identity so often descend into cynicism and ambivalence. And there are many, but tonight I just want to concentrate on three. The first is corporatization. We have been rapidly moving to a place where identities can be shorn of their radical underpinnings and sold quite simply as difference. Difference is good, not least because it brings with it the illusion of change. Indeed, the more we can get institutions to look different while they act the same, the better. And to achieve this, we have to shift the guise from systemic oppression and systemic change and focus on the specific identities of the people running the systems involved. This is what Angela Davis told me was the difference that brings no difference and the change that brings no change. Every time we hail the advance of a member of an underrepresented group within a polity or an institution, without explaining why we are hailing it and what benefit it will bring to others, we make space for this mistake. This does nothing for people who need change and everything for systems that make their best efforts to thwart it. Every time we salute the advance of an individual without explaining how it furthers the advance of many, we lose the opportunity to make the point that we are not talking about individuals, but systems. Which brings me to the second pitfall, which is individualism. As I mentioned earlier, not all of our personal identities, some of which are extremely important to us, are necessarily also social and political identities. And that does not make them necessarily less important to us as individuals, but it does make a difference to their social and political currency. Tiger Woods, having just been named the best or the first black golfer to win a series of competitions, went on to define himself as Cablinasian, a compote of Caucasian, Black, Indian and Asian. I'm just who I am, whoever you see in front of you, he said. Well, we are all just who we are, and who we are is not simply a matter of our own creation. At root, all identities are created by us to make sense of the world that we live in. That doesn't mean that there are no differences between people. Black people generally look different to white people, in turn look different to Asian people. Women have different bodies than men. Different religious groups draw from different spiritual stories and worship different kinds of gods. But the meaning assigned to those differences is a matter of social construction. I think there are two basic rules that we need to apply here. And the first is that everyone has the right to call themselves whatever they want. If Woods wants to call himself Cablinasian, or Rachel Dolezal wants to call herself Black, or Teresa Heinz Kerry, the white millionaire who was born in Mozambique, wants to call herself African American, then we should respect that. We should honour self-definition, not to honour the subject, but because it's infinitely preferable to allowing anyone to be defined by others. Harry Walcott argued that the human approach to experience is categorical, and what we don't label, others will, leaving us at their mercy. We are better off to supply labels of our own and to be upfront about the identifications we seek. Any black person, certainly of my generation, will know this only too well when you say to people, when I would say to people I was British at university. I remember an elderly guy asking me where I was from, and I said, Stevenage. He said, well, where were you born? I said, well, Hitchin. And he said, well, before then. There was none before then. He said, well, where are your parents from? Barbados. Oh, you're from Barbados. No, I'm from Stevenage. So it goes on. I've spent quite a lot of time trying to tease out in my working life the nuances between race and class and gender and nationality and so on, but I'm probably best known now for going shouting crackers at a Nazi in a car park, the interview that I did with Richard Spencer. And one of the interesting things about that interview is the distinction between the assumption that I was demanding the right to be called British and what I actually demanded, which is you don't get to tell me what I am, which I think is an essential human demand and an urgent demand. But with that right comes at least one responsibility. For that identity to be social, and without it being social, it's difficult to understand how it becomes political, it must make sense to others. Not everyone, but enough people. A tree, explains Kwame Anthony Appiah in The Ethics of Identity, whatever the circumstances, doesn't become a legume or a vine or a cow. The reasonable middle view is that constructing an identity is a good thing if self-authorship is a good thing. But that the identity must make some kind of sense, and for it to make sense, it must be an identity constructed in response to facts outside itself, things that are beyond one's own choices. Crudely, it's not about you, it's about us. Or at least, if it's about you and you alone, then you need to convince me why I should be interested. Finally, essentialism. Because essentialism will kill us all. Appeals to the innate, fixed, pure and essential nature of any identity, of the stock in trade of any fundamentalist, and generally have the same effect. To isolate one particular group from the rest of the human race. The rhetorical shortcuts often taken by radicals to galvanize the oppressed all too often lead to a cul-de-sac. For while the right seems like the natural home for those who guard the notion of a never-changing identity, it can just as easily find its home among the liberal left, the peddlers of purity and authenticity, who will point to women's nurturing impulses or the rhythms of Africa that run through the black diaspora soul. Nor is it just the right that is want to frame change as undesirable per se. And I think a good example here is gentrification. It's a familiar charge, often made in London but elsewhere, particularly in poor black areas, that wealthy white people moving in and changing the character of a neighbourhood is a bad thing. And while this is often true, it is not in itself a particularly strong argument against gentrification. There is no principle one could advance as to why an area should remain black or poor, or black and poor. Indeed, many of the areas that are black and poor today were rich and white yesterday. And when the poorer black people came in, the richer white people said they are changing our neighbourhood. And they may well be again. Taken at face value, complaints about white people moving into an area and changing its character aren't different in their logic from complaints about poor non-whites moving into an area and changing its character, even if the motivations for and consequences of those fears are quite different. Now that doesn't mean that gentrification is a good thing or an unimportant trend, but the issue is not whether an area looks different demographically, it's changing economically, but the extent to which people who live in that area feel ownership of the changes that are taking place, as opposed to being marginalised in their own communities, or worse still, forced out of them. It's not, I believe, a question of identity, it's a question of power and resources, first and foremost, rather than of whether a place is changing or not. But when we absent ourselves from these kind of distinctions, we do leave the door open for all kinds of haters and hucksters who can do real damage, who can say, well, you oppose this, and we oppose this in exactly the same way. You want your area to stay the same, and so do we. For all the ways in which the right has hung the noose of identity politics around the neck of the left, it has been they who have been most shameless, and I would argue successful, in employing it. Were it not for an innate nostalgia regarding British and specifically English identity that was galvanised during the Brexit referendum, we would not be leaving the European Union, I think. Unless, of course, the other side had evoked a popular affection for Europe as a counterweight, but it didn't. Some on the left in America correctly blame Trump's victory on identity politics. But bizarrely, they blame Hillary Clinton as the culprit. It's not obvious to me which identities they are referring to with her. She spoke about women and being female, but how couldn't she? That's, first of all, her story, and given Trump's misogynistic outbursts, she had little choice. She appealed to the gay communities and black communities, just as Democrats always do. She didn't promise them anything, and those people have votes too. It was Trump, in his appeal to white people, to Christians, to nationalism, to patriotism, xenophobia and machismo, who leveraged identity politics to devastating effect. It's Richard Spencer, one of the leaders of the Charlottesville rallies, who cites Israel as an example when he talks about setting up a white ethno-state. This is the agenda of, not Spencer's, but the identity politics of Hungary's Viktor Orbán or France's Marine Le Pen. Race and nation, blood and soil. Now, we don't have to stop what we're doing because they are doing it too, or because they will distort what we're doing. But we do need to be sure that the vision of society that we are creating is not one that can be grafted, inverted, and used against us. In conclusion, the thing that we forget about the story of the boy who cried wolf was that when all was said and done, there actually was a wolf. So when people claim an impending and existing clash of civilizations, there is always, of course, a chance they might be right. When it comes to identity, there is always a wolf lurking somewhere. There's never been a time in human history when someone hasn't been trying to rally one group against another on the basis of their difference. But the other thing often forgotten about the fable is that the villagers' instinct was to band together and protect the boy and his flock, and they didn't stop immediately after they discovered he was lying, but they kept trying. Because there's also never been a time in human history when some people, and sometimes many people, have not defied attempts to divide them on the basis of their difference, and instead united to defend or expand human rights. All too often, those people have been all too few, but that simply makes their achievements all the more impressive. Identity is not seeking a role in politics, it is there. Nor is it seeking a role in our lives, it is there too. For better, for worse, and usually for both, it's an integral part of how we relate to people as individuals and as groups. The choice is whether we want to succumb to its perils amidst moral panic and division, or leverage its potential through solidarity in search of common and higher ground. Identity is like fire. We have at times been lulled to sleep in its warm glow, only to wake up feeling burned.
Thank you very much, Gary. We do have some time for questions now, and we have some microphones as well. So, anybody for a question? First question? Obviously.
It's one of them.
Thanks very much, Gary. On St George's Day, I think I'm right in saying that, The issue that I've been thinking about is this kind of, maybe it's quite an obscure debate, but I'd be interested to get your view on it, whether or not nationality and British nationality and English nationality is something that's worth salvaging as a progressive force, or is it too far gone, essentially, especially in context of what you said about Brexit and the galvanisation of it for that cause?
It's a good question. I don't think it's I don't think it's too far gone. The reason being that the nation state is still the most functional democratic unit that we have, and therefore we have to do something with it. I mean, we do have some levers of power in terms of elections and lobbying and so on when it comes to the British state. And it's going to be difficult to understand how we do that if you don't have some, if not through some notion, or with some notion of British identity. I mean, I think English identity is more tricky because beyond the football team, I mean, it's a 90 million nation, you know, beyond the football team, even the cricket team is not exactly English. I think we could be from Northern Ireland playing English cricket team, and I mean, it's all kind of quite odd. It only exists as a nostalgic aspiration to kind of past that barely ever existed. So I'm not really convinced what we can do with Englishness as such. But once again, with this Windrush story, it's been interesting to see how people have mobilized around a version of our history that I didn't know was as popular as it was. You know, these people built our country. I mean, who knew? You know, and you know, they've changed Britain for the better, and this, and so even if it was completely dying, I would still be saying, well, what this is the unit that we are stuck with, the nation state. We have very little in the way of local democracy anymore, and it would be great to have more of that. But given that the nation state is what we've got, then that's what we've got to work with. And that there are, unless we cede the ground completely, then look at what has been done with versions of Scottish nationalism, for example. And there are versions of it. It's not like one has won through. So there are iterations of national identity that aren't completely reactionary. They're all problematic, as most identities are. But so yeah, I do think it's something worth engaging with, Britishness in particular.
Shy people here tonight. Anyone?
You mentioned Rachel Dolezal, who was obviously a really sort of difficult to deal with character. I was wondering if there's anything you could say about the fact that people who often do define themselves in a way that doesn't make a lot of sense to most other people. Do you think there's anything in the fact that they often then feel that they are entitled to speak for what everyone says they're not actually representing? So I mean, that's very badly phrased.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody, unless you're elected, then I think everybody should be wearing a speaking thing all the time, because it's too easy to misspeak from them. And I've got to say, I was less put out by the Rachel Dolezal thing than many other people on my Facebook timeline anyway. But I think that represents something. Because she had actually been engaged in anti-racist work. She had been kind of pretty much putting her life in anti-racist work. And I do think it's more important what you do than what you say you are. Now, that doesn't mean that what she said she was not a problem. And a challenge in a way. But I thought it was really interesting how this woman, I think she was in Spokane, Washington. I mean, it's not like, she wasn't running the Nation of Islam, do you know what I mean? It was like she was running the NAACP in quite a small place in Washington State. It was intriguing to me how that blew up to be the kind of, you know, international kind of scandal that it was. I kind of, when I read about it, I thought it was kind of eccentric and unsustainable. But the kind of some of the responses in terms of appropriation, when I think of what I've been through and what she's been through and how there she, I just kind of couldn't actually get there. And I think there's an object lesson in nobody speaking for anybody unless they've been elected. That kind of the behalfism that all too often takes place rarely ends well. You know, so I think there are better cautionary tales for that than her. But she did pose a challenge to an awful lot of people. If we say that identity is fluid, then that thing of like, why not? So why can't she do that? Lots of people didn't have a good answer for that, I think. And one of the most curious things I think is that we are used to, black people are used to people going in the other direction, of people passing. And we don't think it makes them white, but there is a recognition that they've gone into a different space and they're probably not coming back. But people usually pass for advantage. They don't usually go the other way around. So I remember when I was doing Who Are We, there's a chapter on gatekeepers, and there I looked at the definition of who is and isn't a Jew in Israel, which has kept changing for a series of political reasons. And at one point, they felt that they had been too liberal in assigning the conversions court, in assigning Jewishness to people. And so people got a letter saying, sorry, we know that you said you were Jewish, but you're not. So, you know, our bad. But, you know, feel free to reapply. And of course that put an awful lot of people out. But when I spoke to a Jewish historian, he was saying, well, for quite a few centuries it really wasn't a problem. Anyone who said they were Jewish could be Jewish because nobody wanted to be Jewish. So the door was open. It's only since there's been advantage through citizenship in Israel to be Jewish that this has had to be kind of, you know, policed at all. And that's pretty similar to being black, really. I mean, who's opting for that? Do you know what I mean? You know, you need some of that incarceration and kind of levels of harassment. That's what I could do in this case. It's actually quite rare, and that's what made it so eccentric.
Thanks, Gary, for being deep yet accessible. My question was around the point you were making about gentrification. And I suppose I'm wrestling with this idea, is it really the same for black and white people? But because you mentioned about power, but isn't it the fact that power itself is racialized? You know, so can we find examples where white people move into neighbourhoods, the schools get worse, there's no access to healthcare, etc., in the same, so in the opposite kind of way?
I guess, I mean, you're right, of course, power is racialized, but then let's talk about power. That's what we call it. Let's talk about power and resources, because when we talk about race and demography, we open ourselves up to people saying, well, you know, the East End has changed, you know, and we hated that change. We lived there for years and years, and then all of those people came in, and the problem isn't that the people coming in are white. The problem is that whiteness comes with power, and that power is going to dislodge people and price them out, and that's the problem. And so, quite often with these things, I think it's about how we frame the problem. And I think the problem, you just named it, is the power, not the whiteness. And that decoupling those two actually helps keep the borders tight. What is it that we actually don't want? Because to hear some people talk, you would think that the problem is white people and rich people. Not what they do, but just that they are. And I just, that makes me really uncomfortable. And it's one of those things, a little bit like, there's a great online video of a guy called Ill Doctrine talking about how to tell people when they said something racist. Really good. If you get a chance, guys called Ill Doctrine, and it's called what to do when people say something racist. And he draws a distinction between the who you are conversation and the what you did conversation. And he says the who you are conversation, you are a racist. You're always going to lose that one, because you're talking about their motivation, and they can say, you can't look into my soul, you don't know me, blah, blah, blah. Whereas if you concentrate on what they did, then you can hold them responsible for their words and actions. And he said, the problem with saying, I think that dude's a racist, isn't because you might be wrong, it's because you might be right, and you were going to let them off. And this is kind of what I'm getting at with the gentrification argument, is that actually getting the framing of what the problem is matters, because it makes it harder for people to wriggle out of and to then talk about, well, my granny grew up here, or, you know, I went to a comprehensive, or any of the kind of weird stuff that people say in order to just not kind of address the point. So I don't think we're talking at cross purposes here. It's just that I think it's actually precisely because of what you said being right, that there is power in whiteness. Well, if you concentrate on the power that is being transferred, then I think we hit the target. When we concentrate on the whiteness, I think we can. I think the target can move and elude us. And actually, like a boomerang, somebody can come back from the
Gary, would you like to take two questions, or still want to go one at a time?
I'm happy to go one at a time.
Hi, so I'm thinking back to that TV programme you mentioned, and that infamous scene in the parking lot where you're confronted with that guy. And I just wanted to ask, if I recall correctly, he's rolling up his sleeves while he's talking to you. And at that moment I wondered whether it might get messy, and whether you did too. And whether you did too, and how might you approach that? But then also the sort of bigger question about doing research with kind of sort of unsavoury characters or groups, and the importance of it for us as social scientists, and that sort of line between journalism and research.
I wasn't actually. There was one thing that I don't think was as clear as it might have been in that video. There was a number of these white supremacists who were Somalians. And that was the scariest thing, because it was Tennessee, it was open carry state, so they might have been armed. And that was particularly unpleasant. Otherwise, I figure that I'm standing there with a TV camera. So how bad is this going to be? Now, obviously, when you look at the number of black people who were shot dead on in full sight, in plain view, that's probably a little bit foolhardy. But I wasn't actually fearing for my personal safety particularly. When it comes to, I think long and hard about whether I should interview him. And there were lots of other people that they wanted me to interview that I wouldn't interview because I thought it was a spectacle. This was a spectacle too, although, and it wasn't, I didn't realise, frankly, that he would be so baroque in his racism. I didn't realise that he would be like, oh really, you're going to say that? I'm used to my racists coming with a bit more sophistication, so I was a bit thrown by that. But the reason I could justify interviewing him is because of his connections to Bannon and Trump, and that this was the pool in which a president shouldn't be two people removed, or one person removed from him. And that's where they are in America. And if you saw the whole documentary, and my kind of, personal wink is that lots of people saw the clip, a lot less people saw the documentary, it's still, a fair amount, but then the documentary is about opioid crisis, it's about white people in America, opioid crisis and economic deprivation and neoliberal globalization and historical amnesia and kind of cultural challenge with things like the Confederate flag or so on. And if you see all that, then interviewing him kind of makes a lot more sense, because he's one of these guys who's hoovering up this anxiety and then, and then leveraging it for his own concern. Without it, it does just look like two dudes going at it in a car. I think that when it comes to, it's quite important to interview people that you don't agree with. It's not important to interview people who say stupid shit necessarily, but it is important to interview people that you don't agree with, and to find out where they're coming from, and to kind of try and understand their impulses, their appeal, their, how they tick. And that, while I wouldn't go as far as that, with Richard Spencer doing that very often, or maybe ever. I've sat down, had dinner with kind of American Republicans who said the most appalling things, the most crazy things, the most insulting things. And just kept on chewing on my steak and thinking, I think I've got enough now, I'm going to go. But that it was important and useful to know where they're coming from, and that there is, people do this differently, but I do have the capacity myself to be constantly kind of like, really, why would you say that? That's interesting. Where did that, what makes you think that? Why, why do you think this keeps happening to you? Or, where did you learn that from? And to kind of keep those conversations going, because I'm curious, but also because I'm not sure what the value is of trying to understand this moment, say, Trump in America, from a distance, without ever speaking to the people who make him possible. And and that requires a certain, it does require a certain kind of mindset that I have to put myself into, and I can't do it for too long, because when covering Republican conventions, that can usually last about 2 days, and then there's kind of just a general misanthropy. Just wears me down, and it stops being interesting. and I did find in America, there was always something of cultural distance, or just a distance of being British. And I did find that as my kids grew up, that distance got shorter and shorter. That it stopped being anthropology. And that my patience with it went down from 2 days to kind of 36 hours kind of thing. And my patience with it got thinner and thinner. Not because I didn't realise they were always talking about somebody's child, but it was more personal, I'm a human being, and kind of to hear people say things that I had seen impacting my children and my family in a kind of cavalier manner was more exhausting than, So I think that, it's difficult and it's necessary, and that once you get to people who are like Richard Spencer, who I believe is beyond pale and kind of a threat to democracy and all of those things, then you have to have a justification. And each person will have their own justification, and a bit like identity, it needs to be a justification that makes sense to others. And it can't be because it's titillating, which, frankly, was where the TV people were coming from. That's really telling. And that's not enough for me, even if our interests aren't really coinciding in that way.
Thanks very much, Gary. I wonder if you could comment on why there is so much stagnation still on the part of the elected left in thinking and talking openly about immigration, and whether you see any openings in the future. The elected left.
It was interesting to see, and I say this because it's interesting. I'm not trying to make a broader sectarian point, but when just doing the research for my last column and seeing who voted against the 2014 Immigration Act, there were 6 Labour MPs, and Corbyn, McDonnell and Abbott, 3 of them. And then the sectarian point, which is that I do think people who wonder why so many people would be so crazy as to elect Jeremy Corbyn to be leader of the Labour Party twice, that they could do worse than look at something like this, where there is a complete absence of moral leadership, and Labour, for reasons I assume of expediency, say, okay, hostile environment, have at it. And I think that the reason that they do that is actually because they are the elected left, and they fear that they won't be elected if they don't. That it's the fear of small numbers, that there are small numbers of people who don't have a vote. What do we get for sticking up for them? How does that benefit us? If we think of the 2014 Immigration Act, it comes when UKIP are polls the biggest party in the European elections. Immigration is understood to be the most important issue, even more than economic concerns during that year, over the year. And Labour makes a mark. It says more immigration control, and that their desire is just for that to go away, not to try and change the conversation, which is why, or not to reframe the conversation, which is why I think when it came to Brexit, and there are a million reasons why people voted to leave the European Union, some of them were fine, some of them weren't, but why they expected, you cannot fatten the pig on market day with 50 years without proper conversation about immigration, and then suddenly people were supposed to get it. Well, where were they going to get it from? The argument had never been made. And I do actually think there is, and we saw little flickers of it, and every now and then you do see little flickers of it. Ayla and Kirby washed up. It usually takes a horrible tragedy. You see these flickers of a constituency that you didn't know existed, that would get it if there was someone who was prepared to put it out there. And that, this year provides a perfect opportunity, I think. It's the 70th anniversary of Windrush, and it's the 70th anniversary of the NHS. And there is a connection between those two things, actually. And British people aren't necessarily that certain what they think of immigration, and some of them don't like it, but they do like the NHS. And the NHS would not, could not, has not existed without immigration, still. And so that's a story that you can tell about the people that built Britain, and the nature of those immigrants has changed over the years, but the fact of them hasn't. And honestly, I think it's a chronic lack of imagination and a spinelessness. And there have been moments when they could have taken that hit, when they've got 201 seat majority. Well, maybe then you can, maybe that's a time for more leadership. But there's always a reason why they were never going to do it. And I think frankly, there are worse things than not being elected, like being morally bankrupt and consigning people to lives of misery, as they did with this Windrush. And I think people are better than that, but I don't think that it's possible, it's reasonable to expect people to get there when those arguments just haven't been made. I mean, I know people here have made them, but the kind of, when no one in a position of political elected leadership has made those arguments, why should we expect that people will come to the sense of common humanity and so on over the notion that these people are taking my stuff? They could get it, but they can't. I don't think people get it on their own.
I'm badly placed to ask a question in the middle. Thank you for your talk, and it seemed to me that children punctuated your talk all throughout, which I found really interesting, both in terms of your children, Windrush children, and I'm wondering, how do we teach, and many of us teach young adults in the room, how would you suggest we reach children before they reach adulthood in terms of talking to them about both the complexities of identity and the arbitrariness of identity? And the sort of follow-up to that is, have you had the opportunity in your work to talk to children and young people in terms of their own self-representation, so not allowing other people to speak to them? I'm thinking of the high school students walking out in the US recently in protest against gun violence, and how some of those walkouts were portrayed in the press. Some were vilified in the press and some were ignored by the press.
I haven't had much chance to talk to them about that. Most of the things I've been talking to young people about for about 4 or 5 years has been tragedy, personal tragedy, death. And I wouldn't want to. I was a lecturer very, very briefly in Brooklyn for a couple of years, but otherwise I wouldn't want to teach, or profess to be able to suggest to teachers how they would teach. I find in the conversations I'm drawn to, being open, like just being open to where young people are going with whatever it is they're going with is the best option. That we have all this baggage, we have these kind of, we have these things that you're allowed to say, you're not allowed to say, or that do work, or that don't work. And what you want is for kids to think critically, not to necessarily agree with you. And so, if my father-in-law is a kick-a-putt, extremely light-skinned, and so my daughter, who's 5, you know, has kind of, but he's not that, you know, and then we had a conversation about that, and it's not like I say, yeah, he is, well, yeah, it's funny that, isn't it? Because people do look, you know, do look different, but, you know, they're saying, what about so-and-so? She's not the same colour as you. She'd like. And then, you know, and it's not necessarily that we reach a conclusion about that. She's 5. But that, or with younger activists, to think about politically black or not politically black, which, you know, I have a position on. And I'm not sure how, unless I'm delivering a speech or something, how useful it is for me just to say, well, you're wrong about that, as opposed to kind of just to tease it out and to see where it goes. And that part of that has to be a sense that, without any false humility at all, I might change. Like a conversation where that you start with a young person where you're not going to change, and you're really just waving them out. I mean, don't think that they won't get that, but that, yeah, identities are fluid, and their application is fluid, and the context changes, and so I found when I did a course, a talk course on identity, a couple of courses at Brooklyn. And yeah, I did come away with kind of, you know, some, I did come away from some of that kind of challenged in some areas. All of which is only to say, I think the conversations that one has, is talking about how do we talk to young people about these things, that we need to talk about in an open way, with a genuine belief or understanding that we may not have the answers, or our answers may no longer apply, or that our answers may not apply to them in a way that they apply to us.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions. We'll also have some time during the reception to speak a little bit more informally. So perhaps maybe if we take one from your side and then one more from this side. Yeah, as you've got the mic.
Thank you, Gary. That was a really interesting talk, and I also really enjoyed hearing you talk on the picket line last month, I think it was. And I was wondering if there was any way of drawing some connection between what you spoke about then and what you've been speaking about today, particularly with this theme of the corporatisation of identities as difference. And I was really struck by the Angela Davies quote of difference that brings no difference, change that brings no change. Goldsmiths, I've been a student here now for several years, done my master's and just finishing my PhD, and I came here because I wanted to learn about identities and power and inequality and all of that, and it has some amazing resources and knowledge banks on that here. But it also trades off that image and in a way that can be disingenuous, and in fact I've learned some of my most difficult lessons about those topics, not through the lectures and the reading list, but through having to challenge the institutional issues of sexual harassment and things like that. So I wondered if you could say something about how we can organise and resist that trend while at the same time building better ways of writing and thinking and building knowledge on these things. I'm also struck by this banner over here of identities with a little red square on it that says 5-year impact factor and a number, and I have no idea what that means, but it's all
It's really good.
it's all okay. But that's good. But it also symbolises to me that the university has been marketised, and everything has to have an impact factor. And so yeah, I don't know what my actual question is, but if you could sort of give some strength to how we can challenge this on future picket lines, that would be great.
I mean, I think that there's so every institution has this challenge, I think, or every liberal institution has this challenge, which is that it has the interests of the institution are often set against the principles of its liberalism, and so there is this kind of constant dialectic, this constant tension, and that, in my experience, one of the first things that's important is to organise, and to organise both as a larger collective, the union or whatever, but then to organise, if there are meaningful things to say, to organise as that group, so to organise as black journalists in the Guardian, we had that, or as women in the Guardian, and that then enables you. They're not democratic institutions, so you're not going to be able to keep. I'm one of the more senior people in the Guardian, but nobody voted for me. Do you know what I mean? So they don't get to. Then I'm not accountable to anything other than my conscience. But when there are these organisations and you are, or these groups, and you're expected to report back, and people will then say to you, well, maybe you could take that with so-and-so because you have this position, then you start to leverage. There's a different centre of power. There's a different centre of, you're located differently. And that can be very enabling. Because you can go to whoever, the HR person, whoever it is, and say, look, I am actually empowered to speak for all of the people who are at this meeting and tell you this. You're no longer an individual, and you're no longer atomized. And the worst experiences in liberal institutions are when you are confronted with how illiberal they can be as an individual, and there's nowhere really to go with it apart from hope. And so I think that's an essential thing, is to organise. And then the second thing, which I do think is important, is to have some red lines, to have some. You have to make the call about how important your personal advancement in the institution is against these things that are bothering you and bothering others. And that doesn't always mean that you're going to do the bravest thing. And strategically, it might be a better idea for you to stick where you are. Do you know what I mean? And eat that shit that time for some greater good. And only really you can make that call. But that I've seen in many places people not want to sacrifice any of their capital, any of their currency, any of their position, and therefore what they've sacrificed is their kind of mental health and their sense of well-being and their sense of value and status. And so sometimes you have to make that call. And actually, so long as the call is made and you know why you made it, what I'm not an advocate of is reckless kind of tantrums. Do you know what I mean? Just going off on one. Who does that help? I think that's kind of quite self-indulgent. But that if you feel like you're not going to be able to leave an institution in a better state than when you found it, then maybe you have to leave. And that maybe your sense of well-being and dignity and so on is more important than what you're going to get out of that institution. And maybe you doing that, first of all, sets an example to others, but also you'll be surprised at how often it's an institution that changes in order to accommodate you, I think. Because it sees itself as legal, because it wants to see itself as legal. There was a good quote from Cornel West once. I was doing a thing with him about Malcolm X, and he said, Malcolm X always wore his funeral suit. And there has to be a bit of that. If you're serious about this stuff, then there are times when you have to put on your funeral suit and you go in and you make your case, and maybe it'll kill you. Not literally, but metaphorically. Maybe you're going to have to walk out. But maybe that's not such a bad thing, either for you or for the institution.
Thanks for the team, it's good. It's really hard now because I've been doing this question for ages, so it's going to turn into a speech. Thanks a lot, Gary, for what you said. But I'm going to come back to Angela Davis again, and that quite that difference that brings no difference. I asked you really a question about the diversity industry. I think that's pretty fair to call it that. Which seems to be on this kind of stage of the journey where it's very administrative. 15% targets across the board, and that will somehow magically lead to change. But in the institution that I'm in, 15% of senior managers is 25 people. And you can probably find enough children of ambassadors who went to Eton with President of the Oxford Union, like two black Tory MPs, to fill those posts without ever changing anything. So I'm just wondering how you articulate a step from kind of diversity targets, which change nothing, to something which is more truthful to that mission, which is about fundamentally changing those organisations.
So I think it's about wrestling it from the targets themselves, wrestling it from the percentages and the so on. Not that that might not also be useful, but the question is, why are we doing it? What is this for? And so, if you keep asking what it's for, then then you can get to a place where you say, well, okay, so we're going to invite that guy in, this Italian archetypal child ambassador. We'll have him in, but actually we've got a lot of people like that already in the office, so I'm wondering why are we doing that? What about this person, this woman, this guy, this, and that's about keeping the differences between those who think that diversity is the point and those that think that systemic change is the point. And for those who think that diversity is the point, the numbers game will always do that. And then you'll find all sorts of people who you didn't even know were black, something like Indian granddad or something like that. And like, oh yeah. And it's also about making sure that they don't do what I call front of house stuff. That it's legal in Britain there are a few places where it's legal to discriminate. One is front of house stuff. In a restaurant, let's say it's an Indian restaurant, you can say we're only employing Indians front because it's for, that's what it's for the ambience and the atmosphere and so on. And there is a thing about front of house staff where you have columnists, news readers. It's why there are so few black people on the Today programme, but loads on the Telecom News. Because you can see them. And on the Today programme they said, well, if you can't see them, it don't matter. Which of course it matters. Which is why the Today programme is so terrible. And so it's the columnists and the newsreaders and the presenters, but rarely the schedulers, the photographers, the editors, the people who are kind of, who get to shape the agenda. And so there's that about these targets. If all you're doing is numbers, or if you're doing numbers in a certain way, then you're not really getting to the kind of systemic issues of the organisation. And that's about constantly reframing and kind of wrenching the conversation from where it's going. Oh, I met this chap at the golf club last week, and he seemed like a nice guy. I can't pronounce his name, but I think he's a great guy. To saying, well, hang on, we shouldn't really be recruiting like that, should we? Did this go out? Was this open? Was this an open recruitment? Which is why when we talk about these things, we are challenging, and why it's not a sexual interest, because when we talk about these things, we are challenging the entire institution to do open recruitment, or to think about scheduling differently, or whatever it is. That if identity politics is working, then it's working for everybody, or it's not working. Now, obviously, it's not working for the people who want to thwart it, but either the gains that it's making can be transferred to others, or you are talking about a sectional, interest. But for the most part, the gains that women make work for black folks, and the gains that gay folks make, work for others. So I think that the way that you challenge that is by making sure at every point that the conversation that you're having is about systemic change and not about diversity. Diversity is not seen as an endpoint, but as a means to something else, which is systemic change.
Thank you very much, Gary. I think I think I might speak for us all here. Thank you. I think a wonderful lecture, challenging at the level of ideas, thinking about how those ideas relate to material circumstances, but then also the idea of practice, what we actually do. We have run out of time for questions now, but we can continue in our reception outside. But if you would like to just all join me now in thanking Gary. If you'd like to join us outside, there's some wine to be drunk, amongst other things. Thank you very much. Oh,